How are we doing today, guys? Today we're going to be talking about the deadlift, and we're going to be going through 3 different variations: the normal conventional deadlift, as well as the sumo and the trap bar. These will be time marked obviously in the video. However, there are a lot of similarities, particularly with how you set your torso up on all 3 lifts. First thing we're going to talk about is grip. So when we're talking about grip, obviously there are 2 main ones, the first being hook and the second being the switch. Obviously you can switch both ways. When we're talking about a hook grip, what that means is that the thumb wraps around the bar first. From there, the fingers will hook round over the top and grip the bar. Now a hook grip will generally go over 2 fingers. Some people will get 3, some people will only get 1. It depends on the person, the diameter of the bar, how long their thumbs are, how long their fingers are. Having said all that, obviously if you're a male in particular, using a 20 kilo bar, sometimes using a 15 kilo bar with a smaller diameter handle can be an advantage, simply just to get the, give you the ability to hook around the bar a little bit nicer. The other variation of grip is obviously the switch grip, where one hand is underhand while the other is over. Now the reason why these 2 things are better and more superior than just a conventional normal double overhand grip with no thumb locked underneath is because it creates a locking into the bar. So the hook grip creates that by using the friction of the thumb on the fingers to create a better grip, which means the bar can't roll, which is what happens when you do a double overhand, is that it starts to roll out of your hand and open up the hand as the weight gets heavier. And typically you can't double overhand your heaviest loads, which is why using these variations is smarter. The switch grip does that by, as it rolls out of one hand, it rolls into the other and vice versa, which means that the friction and the tension is able to be held and you're able to maintain grip on the bar. Now there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way. Switch gripping works fine. However, if you're just training it and you're not necessarily looking to compete, switching in both directions is probably a smart move, just to simply change the forces and how you compress on both sides, as it does change how you lock yourself in. Remember, when you're creating that though, you're trying to keep everything locked tight and you're trying to create the movement primarily through the forearm itself and less through the actual whole arm. Because if you start trying to create it and creating it through the arm, you'll create quite a big twist through the torso, as well as very different compressions on the left versus the right, or the side to side. So you want to be thinking about creating equal tension, and then when you create that rotation, create it primarily at the forearm. That will reduce the amount of bias one direction or the other. Whereas the hook grip is probably my preferred method. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that I use it all the time, because obviously it hurts the thumbs quite a lot. But it allows you to compress equally on both sides, which does make for just a mechanically slightly stronger pull. But having said that, there's plenty of people who are world record holders and very strong lifters with a switch. There's no need to hook grip, and they're certainly not going to necessarily make you stronger. It just has less potential to create compensation, but by the same token, if you lift it smartly, it's not necessarily going to do that. So, going into the traditional deadlift to begin with. First thing I want to talk about is feet. So quite often when people deadlift, particularly when they're deadlifting because my primary sport is CrossFit, in CrossFit, when they're doing high repetitions, they'll quite often set with their feet quite wide and typically with a rotation on the feet. Now, our primary role in a deadlift is to create hip extension. Now, if you sit with your hip rotated out and then create a hip extension, you'll find that you'll run into the end of your hip socket, but your glute will also run out of range real fast. It's already contracted. If you create internal rotation, deliberately rotate the other way, then from there pull backwards, you'll find that you have a lot more range of motion to be able to create a bigger range of hip extension, and the glute maximus will be a lot more involved. This means that you're going to you have a better potential to hip extend, which is the primary thing that we're looking for when we're creating a deadlift. So having the rotation out on the feet actually doesn't make sense for the movements. Having said that, the argument people always make is strong men do it. Strong men are also 140 plus kilos generally, up to where Thor was 200. That's where having that extra bulk and size around their waist and their guts, etc., they need to have that extra room, and they can also stabilize their core significantly better by just having more padding around it. And that's going to create more intra-abdominal pressure. So how they lift is not how someone who weighs below 100 kilos, 70, 80 kilos, or even a female weighing 50, 60 kilos should be lifting. We should be trying to create mechanical advantages and use our body as best as we possibly can. This is why narrow feet, where the outside of the foot is pretty much underneath the outside of the hip, is going to be significantly more advantageous, and it's going to allow you to stabilize your back significantly more. Also, the other reason for the rotation out is that that's going to create a tuck under a lot harder, which pushes you into that flexed lumbar spine position, which is where a lot of people get caught, and obviously they start getting back pain when they're deadlifting. So something to think about with feet just to begin with, because that's a big one that I see, and it's a very simple one to fix. From there, we're looking at putting the feet directly underneath the bar for our setup. We'll go through the setup first, and then we're going to go through the movement cues. So for a setup, feet underneath hips. From there, feet directly underneath bar. You generally want the bar sitting above the middle of the foot, not sitting too close to the shin, because then you have no space to move. From there, we're going to bring our hands down. We're going to grip directly outside the legs themselves. That's going to give us the ability to create a shorter range of motion. Quite often people will grip wider. To grip wider, you have to come down further, but you also have to lift higher. It means that you're actually in a less mechanically efficient position, and you're actually literally doing more work to actually complete a single rep. So narrow those hands down, which is the other benefit of having narrow feet. It reduces the amount of work that's going on. From there, we're looking at creating torso positions. So I'm going to come down, I'm going to be pretty relaxed here. I'm not going to start setting myself up until I actually want to start creating that lift. From there, I'm going to deliberately start to create thoracic flexion. So we deliberately want to flex because that's going to give us more access to our lats. From there, we want to pull the tailbone back and feel those hamstrings start to tension up as you pull into that bottom position. From there, I'm going to let the knees come down until I get my shoulders directly above the bar, shoulder blades, it'll depend on the person. And from there, I can then create a drive upwards to create my lift. Now, that's going to create this very vertical bar path. Now, the reason for flexion, the reason why people always think that flexion is bad is because it typically hurts their back. Flexion is not bad. We want to be sitting into a mid-range. The reason why people get pain is because they sit at end range. They are at end range flexion, or they're at end range extension, can't hold it, and dump into flexion. So the more mid-range you sit in, the stronger you are. A really good example of this, get your friend, hold your arm up as tight as you can, get them to try and pull it away. You'll find that you're significantly weaker up top where you're in end range versus putting it at 90 degrees. Now try and get them to push it down, you'll feel a lot stronger. Same concept when we're talking about the rib cage and the positions that it's holding. We want to put you into a mid-range position. That's going to allow you to support a lot more load, and it's going to stop you from going into collapsed positions or flexed positions. So that's our setup position. I'll talk you through it again as we go into the movement itself. Now, when we're talking about creating the movement, we want to be trying to create internal rotation. So people quite often will crank out when they're doing this, but again, same as earlier with the foot out. If you crank out all the time, your hips are going to want to tuck under because the external rotators, the hips, the glutes, are going to be trying to create external rotation and tuck the hip underneath. Whereas if we utilize the adductors, which are actually really, really good in end range hip extension, as well as the hamstrings themselves, as well as glute max, which is the biggest of your glutes, they're all going to be operating best in slight internal rotation, and it gives them space to externally rotate out into. Now, this means that we want to put pressure through the inside of our foot, not necessarily the outside of the foot. Pronation is very, very good at creating pressure in low positions, similar to what we talked about in our squats. Yes, we will wind up being in supinated position or pressure on the outside of the foot, but we don't want to necessarily start there. So think about putting pressure through the middle of the foot as well as a little bit of pressure through the whole foot. From there, it's going to allow you to utilize your adductors. Now, for the movement itself, where we want to be thinking about at that bottom position, like I said, flexion, tailbone pulled back, etc. You want the shins to be vertical until you can get past the shin themselves. Now, this means that first initial lift, the shoulders and hips are lifting together, and the quads are doing a lot of that work as well as the hamstrings. From there, the shins are going to stay vertical, and the hips are going to come forwards to meet the bar. That way the bar doesn't come back towards you. We're not trying to create a swinging action. This is why it's important to make sure that bar is sitting above the center of the foot at the bottom of the rep. As the hips come forwards, you create lockout by the knees pulling back and the hips coming forwards. Now, this is where a lot of people go wrong, is they try to extend to get their shoulders back behind the bar, or they try to extend to get their shoulders back behind the bar. Now your knees aren't locked. If you just lock out and hold that tight position, I haven't done anything with my shoulders. I'm actually still flexed, and I'm still shoulder behind bar. There is no need to move your upper body whatsoever for any reason at all. You should be staying stable. Your legs should be doing that movement. They're bigger muscles, more powerful muscles. Use them. So don't try and move the upper body when you're doing it. It also makes it harder to come down if you do that. So when you're starting to come down from that locked position, you break at the hip, so that way the hip can start to move backwards and the shoulder can move vertically downwards, which means the shin can stay vertical, which means you can pass the shin and then use the knee to come down to touch the ground. Those are the shapes that we want to be thinking about to both travel up and downwards through the movement. So I'll talk you through that. My feet are underneath my hips. The middle of the foot is underneath the bar. From there, I'm going to grab either side of my legs. From there, I'm going to create flexion through my upper back and breathe into that upper back. From there, pull the tailbone back. Feel those hamstrings. From there, I'm going to deliberately create lockout in those arms and pull myself down so shoulder is directly above the bar. Pull the slack out of the bar and drive my feet through the floor, through the inside of the foot. From there, I am in lockout position. I don't have to create any more movement. Hips travel backwards, knees travel forwards to allow me to touch down on the ground. That's your deadlift, okay? Your traditional deadlift. So now we're going to move straight into the sumo. Sumo, things change obviously with the foot stance, and that changes the dynamics a little bit, but by the same token, it doesn't change anything to do with the locking of the torso. We don't want to be thinking about creating, trying to move differently with our ribcage and the rest of our body. The lock stays the same, just the way the legs move is different. Sumos also aren't a glute movement. People feel the glutes because the glutes are locked into an isometric hold. Doesn't mean that they're doing the most of the work. The adductors, or the inside of the leg, is actually doing most of the work for you because you're in a severely internally rotated position. So we want to be trying to utilize that, as well as a lot of quad, to drive vertically downwards, which is where the big benefit of the sumo is. So when we're creating our foot position, we want to be thinking about creating a vertical position with the knees stacking directly over the ankles, with the toes pointing out. Now that's normal. The toes should move out as you go into wider and wider and wider and wider shapes. Now, in terms of how wide you get, you don't want to be into the point where the knees are stacking and collapsing inwards too badly. They might move in a little bit. Again, a little bit of internal rotation through the hip is not bad. It's fine. Your knee's not going to be hurt, etc. By the same token, we don't want to bias that too much. So stacking the knee directly over the top of the ankle in the same way that we would for a bench press or something similar to that. And then from there, you create all the same movements. So if I set myself, that's probably like a fairly good position, maybe a little bit narrow for me. There we go. Now I've got a more stable foot because I want to be able to drive and push wide as I'm doing that. If I can't push wide and keep a stable foot, when my foot starts rolling, I'm going to be losing a lot of tension through the middle of the leg as well as the outside of the leg. So set myself in. From there, the bar is obviously going to sit over the top of my legs. In terms of grip, you're going to be gripping straight down from the shoulders. Now, depending on where the knurling is on your bar, you still want to be gripping on the knurling itself. You don't want to be gripping onto the smooth stuff, unless obviously it's really lightweight, but you don't want to be getting into that habit. Again, you can hook grip or you can switch grip. It depends on the person. Now, one disadvantage of the switch grip though, is it puts a piece of meat, aka your hand, in between you and the bar, which actually pushes that bar forwards because it's going to hit against that thigh. So it actually is a little bit of a disadvantage going with a switch grip because it creates a little bit of a twist. Having said that, it's not significant. Still plenty of heavy lifters that don't do that, particularly if you've got longer limbs where you're not necessarily going to have that issue. I've got short arms, I'm going to have that issue, so I hook grip over the top. From there, I'm going to deadlift, jump into that bottom position. Same, everything else from there stays exactly the same. From there, I'm going to set, I'm going to flex my upper back, I'm going to pull that tailbone back. From there, I'm going to drop backwards so that my knees, shins are sitting vertical. From there, I'm going to drive vertically to my lockout position. Again, my torso doesn't change. From there, the hips break, knees track out, straight back down. And I'm pressing into the frontal plane, pushing away the entire time to get internal rotation through the legs and keep a stable base on the foot. You will see the inside edge of my shoe just lifting slightly. That's because my shoe's twisting, not because my foot's lifting. So you want to keep the whole pressure on the ground the entire time, and particularly putting pressure through the inside edge of your foot as you're doing that. You can rotate the feet out further to achieve these things. However, having said that, if you start doing that, you lose stability forwards and backwards. So finding that right rotation can be person dependent, and it's about finding what works for you. Okay, final deadlift variation is the trap bar. Probably the simplest variation, mainly because it means you don't have to worry about the knees and navigating the knees. You literally just have to think about setting the torso and drive vertically down. As soon as you drive vertically down, you can create vertical force, and that's what's going to allow you to obviously lift the bar. And obviously you have two variations, handles up, which is what it's currently set to. I've got a rickshaw bar here, so I don't have the other side, versus a handles down position. Now, if you're using the trap bar to make your conventional deadlifts or cleans and Olympic lifts better, you want the handles down, because it means that you're pulling from the same height that you'd normally be. Actually a slight deficit because of the width of the handles, which means you have to, like we said earlier, sit lower, which mimics the cleans quite well, so that's quite a good one to use. Or handles up, which lets you sit into that higher position, which might be more relevant for like sports players, etc. So I'm going to be pulling into this shape. Everything else from there stays exactly the same. Now, sometimes you might want to widen the feet out in these ones to work on something like the sticking point in the back squat, which can be quite relevant and allows you to get used to centering the weight in this shape. So sticking the feet wider can sometimes be useful. We're going to be talking about a deadlift variation here. So we're going to stick to the narrow foot position. From there, I'm going to do everything else the same. Make sure the hands are obviously gripping straight over the top of the pin, so you're centered around those handles. From that point there, flex into the upper back, tailbone pulls back to feel those hamstrings, knees shift forwards as I come up into that vertical shape, and then from there, drive to my lockout position. Cool? That's what we're looking for. Those are the shapes that we want to be creating. Obviously, you can move these to triple extensions. The only variation you'd come there is obviously coming up onto the toes. Cool, that's our deadlift variations, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, leave us a message. Other than that, see you later.